Hello everyone, this is Gene Geog History, and today I'm going to post a video about Cuba, where this is the continuation of my series where I pick a Caribbean country and compare it to the five most similar countries based on a few categories. So things like the geography, the demo, the culture, the government, the infrastructure, and all of that stuff. I'm still going to be using objectivelist.com for my reference points, but I'm doing things a bit more differently where I have the explanations right off the bat. I don't need to go on country index to do it. I'm just going to read off a list and it'll be very simple. So Cuba is one of the countries that I actually did go to, and I definitely know a lot more of the history of Cuba. So despite it being a Caribbean country, I know that the government will be different than a lot of the others, where you might get more non-Caribbean comparisons in comparison to other Caribbean countries, where they mainly just match Caribbean countries. So, at number one, being the country that's the most similar to Cuba, is an obvious one, and that is the Dominican Republic. And I'm basing this on the demographics, culture, government, infrastructure, and geography. So, when it comes to the demographics, they have a similar enough population where the Dominican Republic has a bit more with 11.5 million, with Cuba having 11 million. Both of them have predominantly mixed race, i.e., mulatto populations, with black and white being the other two main racial/ethnic groups there. Both of them speak Spanish, though there's different dialects within it. Both of them are heavily Catholic religions, though a larger extent population in the US comes from Cuba, which makes sense based on where they migrated to. That's pretty much the same thing as a lot of Dominicans migrating to Spain and Puerto Rico. So the main similarity is the mulatto majority. Both are Spanish speaking and both are colonial legacies. But the difference is that Cuba has a stronger, visible African culture and has been more racially egalitarian in this rhetoric, though not necessarily in practice. So pretty much they take the aesthetic of blackness more and they promote it more compared to the Dominican Republic. That's how I kind of see it. The second category is culture. So their music is relatively upbeat. So Cuba is more known for salsa, son, rumba, and mambo, where the Dominican Republic is known for merengue, bachata, and dembow. The dancing in Cuba has a lot more rhythms and traditions from Africa, and there's a lot of state-sponsored cultural institutions within Dominican Republic has a lot more commercialized and youth-driven dance in comparison. When it comes to the literature and art, more Afro-Cuban expression, state censored, but the literature and art is state censored in Cuba, but it's still globally respected. Where in the Dominican Republic, there's freer artistic expression and themes ranging from the diaspora to national pride. When it comes to sports, both of them are very huge in baseball. And obviously, there's a decent amount of similarities when it comes to their cuisine with the type of food that they have, though Cuba's has a bit more simpler ingredients due to the rationing taking place where the Dominican Republic has spicier food. So the main similarity when it comes to the culture is the Afro-Spanish fusion, baseball dominance, and musical richness, where the main difference is the cultural institutions in Cuba are more politicized and state-run, where the Dominican Republic has freer cultural industries and music markets. On to the government. I do think this is the category where they're probably going to be the most different, where the political system in Cuba is a single party communist state, clearly ruled by a communist party, where the Dominican Republic has a multi party democratic republic with regular elections. There's a lot of heavy restrictions, limited freedom of speech, press, and protest when it comes to the civil liberties in Cuba, where there's more free press and speech, though there's still corruption in the Dominican Republic. There's a lot of anti US foreign policies. They're mainly aligned with socialist blocs as they're closer to Russia, Venezuela, and China. In the Dominican Republic, when it comes to the foreign The foreign policy, they are more U.S. aligned. They're pro-capitalist. They are they have strong trade and tourist ties with the U.S. and Europe. With the economic model in Cuba, it is centrally planned, state-dominated, and there's limited market reforms in the recent years. Where in the Dominican Republic, there's a free market capitalist heavily reliant on tourism and remittances. I believe the Dominican Republic is one of the highest, if not the highest, toured Caribbean country. So the similarity they have is the shared colonial past and history of authoritarianism in part of the 20th century, though the major difference or differences is the vast gulf in political freedom, economic openness, and globalization alignment between the two countries. Now we're moving on to the infrastructure when it comes to the transportation. Cuba has a lot of aging cars, poor public transit outside of Havana, and limited internet, which I definitely know from my personal experience when I traveled there. Where in the Dominican Republic, there's more modern highways, better public and private transportation. When it comes to the electricity, it's very unreliable and there are frequent blackouts in Cuba due to heavy underinvestment, where it's a lot more stable in the Dominican Republic, though obviously there's more outages in the rural areas in the Dominican Republic. When it comes to the healthcare, it is free and there's well trained personnel, but there's a lot of shortage of medicine and supplies in Cuba, where it's a mixed quality in the Dominican Republic, where the private sector is strong, though there's less access for poor people. The education in the Dominican Republic has a moderate quality with growing private education sector, where it's free and universal in Cuba with high literacy but under resourced. When it comes to the internet and tech, it's very limited in Cuba and it's very censored and state controlled, where it's widely available in the Dominican Republic, especially in the cities, and there's a growing tech sector there. The overall similarity is that education is valued in both, but the difference is that the Dominican Republic has a more modern and open infrastructure and take on it due to its market share economy, where Cuba is hamstrung by the state control and embargoes that are very prevalent in the country. So the fifth and final category is the geography, where both, sorry, when it comes to the location, Cuba is the largest island of the Caribbean, though it's isolated from other nations. Where the Dominican Republic obviously shares an island with Haiti, though it takes up two-thirds of that island. Both of them have very similar tropical climates, though the Dominican Republic is a bit more mountainous with fertile valleys, and Cuba is a bit more hurricane prone in comparison. Both of them suffer from hurricanes, flooding, and coastal erosion, though it's a bit worse in the Dominican Republic due to the terrain there. And when it comes to the natural resources, there's nickel, tobacco, and sugarcane in Cuba, where the Dominican Republic also has sugarcane, but also has gold, silver, and heavy tourism assets like the ecotourism and beaches there. So the overall similarity with this category is the Caribbean nations with tropical climate share disaster risk and colonial era monocultural roots, where the difference is that Dominican Republic is more mountainous and shares its island with Haiti, affecting border policy and migration differences or dynamics. So, at a close second, with being the country most similar to Cuba, is Venezuela with a score of 74.2, meaning it has a zero point 0.5 score less than the Dominican Republic. So, it was a really close one. So, I'm going to go through all of the categories and then we'll see how they're similar and different. So, the first category is the demographics, where Venezuela has over twice the amount of people in Cuba with 28 million, though it has decreased due to immigration. Though obviously Cuba is an island, Venezuela is a huge landmass on an actual continent. So the racial makeup is kind of different. It's kind of similar but kind of different at the same time, where roughly 64% of the population in Cuba is mixed race, but I think it's more mulatto than mestizo since there isn't a high indigenous component in Cuba for there to be mestizos, where in Venezuela it is mestizo, where they're half European, half indigenous American. That's their mixed racial makeup there. There's a much larger white population in Venezuela than Cuba, and of course, the black population in both is just relatively small. Obviously, both speak Spanish, though there's different dialects where there's some African and Andalusian influence when it comes to their Spanish, where in Venezuela, there's Andean, Caribbean, and European influences for Venezuelan Spanish. Obviously, both of them are heavily Spanish, though there is some Santeria influence in Cuba, which is an Afro Cuban religion. There's a lot more secularism due to communism there, too. So, when it comes to the diaspora in Venezuela, millions have fled in the past decade to Colombia, Peru, and the US due to all the economic and political stuff happening in that country, where obviously for Cuba, a large expat population moved to Miami. So the main similarity is they're both Spanish speaking, a Catholic majority, and racially mixed societies with strong diasporas. The difference is that Venezuela has a larger and more ethnically diverse population, and Cuba's Afro Caribbean identity is more prominent and institutionally integrated. The second category is culture, where in the music there's son, salsa, rumba, trova, and globally influential Afro-Cuban genres, or all of those type of music is strongly influential Afro-Cuban. Where in Venezuela, there's joropo, salsa, so that's the similar genre of music between both countries, reggaeton, and there's strong influence from both the Caribbean and Andean cultures with there. The dance in Cuba has a lot more Afro-Cuban elements to it, where joropo and salsa dancing is popular in Venezuela, though the music is more regionally varied, and I guess it shows in the dance. I do think there's quite a bit of differences when it comes to their food, where in Cuba it's mainly rice, beans, pork, yuca, and there's limited variety due to rationing. And I definitely remember that experience when I went to Cuba, where in Venezuela there's arepas, empanadas, pelon, criollo, richer variety, but scarcity. Sorry, it's more scarce in recent years. When it comes to both countries, baseball is very huge in both. When it comes to the arts, there's more revolutionary art in Cuba, though it's more censored due to obvious reasons, though it's globally respected, where the arts in Venezuela is more regional, though there's diverse too, though there is some politicization of it under the Chavismo. So the similarity when it comes to the culture is both have a huge baseball exception, they have a shared love for salsa, and there's similar colonial legacies in the cuisine and religion. The difference is that Cuba's culture is more influenced by African traditions, where Venezuela blends Caribbean, Andean, and indigenous influence more evenly. So the third category is the government. So there's a one-party communist system in Cuba where there's a nominal multi-party democracy, but there's a de facto authoritarian regime under PSOV, which is under the Chavista rule. So when it comes to the leadership, it's under Miguel Diaz-Canel, who's the Communist Party leader in Cuba, where it's under Nicolas Maduro, who's the successor to Hugo Chavez, ruling through centralized power. Okay, so there is diminished freedoms in Venezuela when it comes to media representation, political persecution, but there are formal electoral processes which makes it different from Cuba, where obviously there are severe limitations, there's very tight censorship, restricted movements, and protests. When it comes to their foreign policy, they're very anti-US, obviously due to the embargo, and they're aligned with China, Russia, and Venezuela. And Venezuela also has similar allies with Cuba. Obviously, it's aligned with Cuba. They're both aligned with Russia and China, and Venezuela is also aligned with Iran. And Venezuela has an ideological anti-imperialism foreign policy. When it comes to the economic system, it's centrally planned in Cuba with heavy state control, and there are some recent reforms where in Venezuela it's a very independent socialist economy. And I think that's one of the reasons why there's a lot of issues between them and Guyana. Currently, there's a lot of hyperinflationary and crisis ridden, and there's partial privatization under Maduro, the leader. So the main similarity is the socialist orientation anti-US stance and centralized conflict, and they are also allied with one another. The main difference is that Cuba is ideologically pure communist, where Venezuela is more of a hybrid when it comes to being a socialist in discourse, but also authoritarian capitalist in crisis. The fourth category is the infrastructure, where the transportation in Cuba is very outdated with old American cars from the mid 20th century. There's very poor public transportation, and there's weak road networks. Where in Venezuela, the major cities have very strong infrastructure, or had, my bad, strong infrastructure, but it's now degraded. There's shortages of gasoline and transport chaos as well. Both of them suffer from frequent and massive blackouts, though the recent are kind of different. There's limited fuel and modern equipment in Cuba, where there's a lot of corruption and decaying grid in Venezuela. So the healthcare is free and widely accessible in Cuba, though it is under resourced. There is a strong doctor training program there, where in Venezuela, there's the public system essentially collapsed. The healthcare is mainly private and for the wealthy only, and there's severe medicine shortage. So it's a huge problem there. Both of them have free education, though the system has collapsed in Venezuela. There's brain drain and there's lack of resources, where there's a high literacy in Cuba, but there's limited academic freedom. There's limited internet access in Cuba, and it's also censored and state run, where in Venezuela there's increasing access, but it's also censored and disrupted, where the digital poverty is rising in the country. So the main similarity when it comes to the infrastructure is that they're both essentially in crisis. There's a lot of blackouts, shortages, and deteriorating services, where the difference is Cuba's system is more stable but also very limited, where Venezuela was once modern but they've imploded more severely due to the collapse and corruption. The fifth and final category is the geography. Obviously, Cuba's an island in the Caribbean Sea, where Venezuela is in the northern coast of South America, and it's a part of the Caribbean coastline as well, where there is a part that has jungles in it and is attached to the Andes. Both are tropical, warm areas. Cuba's more hurricane prone, and obviously, the climate in the Andes plains, jungles, and deserts is going to be a bit different in Venezuela than on the coast. When it comes to the terrain, it's mostly flat with rolling hills in Cuba, though there are mountains on the east side of the country, where it's very diverse in Venezuela, where there's coastal plains, high mountains, i.e. the Andes Mountains, Llanos, and Amazon rainforest in the south. The natural resources in Cuba involve sugar, tobacco, nickel, and some offshore oil, where in Venezuela there are massive oil reserves among the world's. It is amongst the world's largest. There's gold, gas, iron, and fertile plains. When it comes to the environmental challenges, there's hurricanes, coastal erosion, and droughts in Cuba, where there's a lot of flooding, droughts, oil pollution, and deforestation, and there's infrastructure decay in Venezuela. So the main similarity is both have the Caribbean climate, there are tropical risks, and they have coastal economies. But the difference is Venezuela is far more ecologically diverse and resource rich, where Cuba is more agriculturally limited and isolated. So overall, the top similarities is they're both Spanish, they have Catholic roots, revolutionary socialist governments with centralized control, heavy censorship and suppression of dissent, strong baseball and salsa traditions, infrastructures weakened by economic and political crisis, and they are both very anti-US, pro-Russia and China when it comes to their foreign policy allegiances. Top differences is their political model, economic crisis, culture, where it's more Afro-Caribbean in the Cuba, where it's more diverse in the Venezuela. There's more hyperinflation, and when it comes to the economic crisis with the oil crash and massive corruption in Venezuela, where there's just consistent underdevelopment in Cuba. Cuba is a pure communist regime where it's an authoritarian hybrid in Venezuela. The geography is obviously different between the two countries because Cuba is an island, it's isolated, and it has uniform refrain. Venezuela is a very large, ecologically diverse mainland nation. The healthcare and education is state-led but stable in structure in Cuba, where it's formerly strong and is now a collapse in Venezuela. So the third most similar country to Cuba at number 3 is Nicaragua, with a score of 72.1. So it's 2 points lower than the top two. So there's a bit of distance, but not too much. So when it comes to the demographics, Cuba has a bigger population than Nicaragua, almost twice the amount actually, with Nicaragua at 6.9 million, with Cuba at 11 million. Both of them have a majority mixed race population, though the mixed race in Cuba is more so mulatto, where it's mestizo in Nicaragua, where it's 70% mestizo, essentially. Both speak Spanish, though in Cuba there's Caribbean inflections, while in Nicaragua, there's Central American dialect, and there are some indigenous and English speakers on the Atlantic coast of that country. Both of them are predominantly Catholic, though there's Santeria in Cuba, and there's a lot of evangelical Protestants in Nicaragua as well. So, when it comes to the diaspora, yet again, most of the Cubans who are diasporic Cubans are living in Miami, while in Nicaragua, a lot of them migrate to Costa Rica, the US, and Spain, and it's mainly driven by poverty and repression. So, the overall for this category is they're both Spanish speaking, they have heavily mixed race populations, and they're large immigrant groups. While the main difference is that Cuba has a stronger Afro descent cultural influence, where Nicaragua has more mestizo and indigenous blend, especially in the east. When it comes to the culture, we are looking into the music for the first category, where there's a much bigger global aspect from Cuba with salsa, son, rumba, and mambo, where Nicaragua has more local musical styles like marimba, palo de mayo, which is Afro-Caribbean, and there's less international presence of Nicaraguan music. When it comes to the dance, in Cuba, it's a lot of Afro-Caribbean styles with state cultural investments, while in Nicaragua, there are regional dances like El Guiguinis, don't mind me, I'm not good at Spanish at all, and indigenous festivals where there's more grassroots than institutional. When it comes to the cuisine, there's a lot of rice, beans, and pork, which is limited by rationing due to the embargo stuff, while in Nicaragua, there's a lot of corn-based dishes like gallo pinto, nacatamales, stronger indigenous influence overall. Both are obsessed with baseball when it comes to their sports, though there's also boxing, though it's a bit sorry. Yeah, boxing is very popular in Central America, though baseball is a bit more rare in Central America compared to the Caribbean. When it comes to their literature and art, there are more revolutionary themes in Cuba and its state-directed culture there, while there's rich poetry tradition, examples being Ruben Dario in Nicaragua, and there's less controlled cultural sector until the recent repression. So the overall similarities: baseball culture, shared Spanish colonial legacy, revolutionary themes, while the main differences: Cuba's culture is more internationally recognized and shaped by Afro-Caribbean elements. Nicaragua has a more Central American indigenous tone. So when it comes to the government and the system, Cuba has a single-party communist state, where Nicaragua has an authoritarian regime under nominal democracy, which is ruled by FSLN and Daniel Ortega. When it comes to the leadership, it is Miguel Diaz-Canel in Cuba, which is a party-led system, and it is Daniel Ortega since 2007 in Nicaragua, and it's increasingly dictatorial. The civil liberties The civil liberties in Cuba is highly restricted. There's censorship, controlled press, and no opposition. Where in Nicaragua, there are civil liberties severely curtailed since 2018. There are protest bans, jailed dissidents, and media crackdown. When it comes to their foreign policies, Cuba is very anti-US. They are aligned with Russia, China, and Venezuela. Well, Nicaragua has similar alliances, as both Cuba and Nicaragua have strong ties to one another, especially through the ALBA bloc. When it comes to the economic system, Cuba is centrally planned or has a centrally planned economy with some reforms, where Nicaragua has a mixed economy, formerly capitalist but increasingly centralized and corrupt under Ortega's rule. So the overall similarities: they are long-standing leftist regimes, restricted freedoms, anti-US rhetoric, and strong ties with Cuba and Venezuela. Well, Cuba is one of the countries, but they both have strong ties to Venezuela. The main difference is Cuba is ideologically socialist. Nicaragua has more political theater of democracy and wider corruption networks. So when it comes to their infrastructure, we're going to get into the transport, where there's a lot of old cars, crumbling roads, and poor rural access, especially outside of Havana and Cuba. While in Nicaragua, there's a basic road system, though it's better than Cuba's in some areas, and the urban transit is very underdeveloped. When it comes to the electricity, it's very unreliable in Cuba. There are blackouts that are very common, and there are energy shortages, where in Nicaragua, it's more stable but regionally uneven. The rural electrification is improving, but it's still limited. The healthcare is free, universal, highly trained doctors, but short on supplies in Cuba, where it's a free public system but underfunded, poor access, especially in rural areas in Nicaragua. The education in Cuba is free, universal, high literacy through though ideologically censored, while in Nicaragua, there's a free education public system with high enrollment but under-resourced and politicized. When it comes to the technology and internet, it's heavily censored, expensive, and limited access in Cuba, where it's more available than in Nicaragua, but it's increasingly surveilled and censored since the 2018 crackdown. So the overall similarities when it comes to this section is underfunded but universal healthcare and education, authoritarian use of infrastructure. The main difference is Cuba has a better trained medical workforce, while Nicaragua has slightly more open but fragile infrastructure. And now we're in the fifth and final category, which is the geography. So when it comes to location, Cuba is an island nation in the Caribbean Sea, while Nicaragua is in Central America. It's bordered by Honduras, Costa Rica, the Pacific Ocean, and the Caribbean Sea. The terrain in Cuba has flatlands, hills, and mountains on the east, where it's diverse in Nicaragua, as there's lakes, volcanoes, rainforests, mountains, and dual coastlines. The natural disasters in Cuba are hurricanes and coastal flooding, where it's also hurricanes in Nicaragua, with the inclusion of earthquakes, volcanic activity, droughts, and flooding. The natural resources in Cuba are nickel, sugarcane, tobacco, and offshore oil potential, where in Nicaragua it's gold, silver, timber, coffee, beef, fertile soil, geothermal energy. The environmental zones in Cuba is tropical, savanna, and rainforest, where in Nicaragua it's ecologically diverse, Pacific, dry, tropics, central highlands, and Caribbean rainforests. The similarity is hurricane prone and tropical climate overall, but the main difference is Nicaragua is geographically more diverse and seismically active, where Cuba is more isolated and uniform. So, in conclusion, they are both Spanish speaking revolutionary governments with strong anti US ideology, restricted civil liberties, and increasing authoritarianism. Baseball is a national sport in both weak but free education and health systems, immigration driven diasporas due to repression and poverty, close allies in international forums, examples being ABBA, Black. When it comes to the differences, Cuba is more Afro descended, where Nicaragua is more Indio mestizo descended, or I should say Afro mulatto for Cuba. Cuba is an island and it's isolated, where Nicaragua is a mainland, more ecologically diverse and controlled. Cuba is a pure communist state, where Nicaragua is an authoritarian pseudo-democracy. The economic model is centrally planned in Cuba, though it's a mixed capitalist economy with creeping centralization in Nicaragua. The cultural influence is a large global cultural reach when it comes to the music and medicine in Cuba, where it's more regionally focused and less globally prominent in Nicaragua. At fourth is Panama with a score of 72. So it's literally a point 0.1 score lower than Nicaragua. So it easily could have been third. Now, on to the five categories. We're going to focus on the demographics first. So when it comes to the population, Cuba has a much larger population with 11 million to Panama's 4.5 million. When it comes to the ethnic composition, both of them have a 64 to 65% mixed race population, though the mixed race is different in Cuba, where it's more mulatto, where it's mestizo in Panama, and they have small black, white, and indigenous communities, though it's 27% in Cuba, where the numbers for everything else is pretty low regarding the white, black, and indigenous number. They both speak Spanish, so it's a Caribbean variant in Cuba and a Central American Sure, a Caribbean variant in Cuba and a Central American variant in Panama, and English is spoken in urban/business areas in Panama. They're both heavily Catholic, though there's some partisan legacy from the U.S. Canal Zone in Panama, where there's still Santeria and other secular learnings in Cuba. Panama has a smaller diaspora, mostly economic migrants that move to the US and Spain, where there's a very large exile population in the US through Miami. So the biggest similarity is that they're both Spanish-speaking mixed-race populations and Catholic heritage. The difference is that the Panama has a more diverse ethnic mix, including large Asian and indigenous communities, and a stronger Protestant influence due to the U.S. presence. When it comes to the culture, I think their music's pretty similar, just from what I see here. There's strong Caribbean and Afro elements in the music. Panama, specifically Afro-Antillean roots, where there's a lot of Afro-Caribbean roots in Cuba, and it's globally known there, like son, rumba, salsa, and trova, where it's mainly reggaeton, reggae, and Espanol, so essentially English reggae, and Tepiquio in Panama. They both have salsa as a major dance, and they have other Afro-Caribbean dances in those countries. There's also indigenous folk dance and tamborito, which is a national dance in Panama. When it comes to their cuisine, it's very simple in Cuba: rice, beans, pork, and there's a limited variety due to the rationing, and there's more variety in Panama, like sancocho, seafood, Chinese Panamanian fusion, and tropical fruits. Baseball's huge in both countries, so there's an Olympic state investment in Cuba. Soccer is also very popular in Panama, and boxing is also a source of national pride. When it comes to art and literature, Panama's is less globally recognized. It blends Caribbean, indigenous, and modern Latin styles, where in Cuba there are revolutionary themes and it's government funded. So when it comes to the culture, the similarities are baseball, Caribbean rhythm in music, and Spanish colonial base. The difference is that Cuba is more Afro-Caribbean and globally renowned culturally. Panama's culture is a cosmopolitan fusion due to immigration and the Canal Zone legacy. So the third category is the government, where it's a presidential democracy with multi-party elections in Panama, and it's a one-party communist state in Cuba. The leader is Miguel Diaz-Canel, who's the leader of the Communist Party in Cuba, where the leadership is under democratically elected presidents in Panama, where it's currently Jose Raul Mulino as of 2024. When it comes to the civil liberties, it's highly restricted, censored press, and no opposition parties in Cuba. There's generally free press, independent judiciary in Panama, though there is some corruption. When it comes to their foreign policy, there is definitely some differences. Cuba is very anti-US. It is aligned with Russia, China, and Venezuela, where Panama is a US ally. It's a neutral foreign party, and it's a major global trade hub. When it comes to the economic model, Cuba is centrally planned, ration-based under reform. At Panama, it is a capitalist, service-driven, heavily reliant on trade, finance, and the canal. So the similarity when it comes to the government is that they are both historically influenced by US geopolitics. The difference is that Cuba is a socialist dictatorship, while Panama is a liberal capitalist democracy with strong international ties and foreign investments. Onto the infrastructure. Cuba has crumbling roads, outdated vehicles, and limited public transit for the transportation, where Panama has modern highways, metro in Panama City, and international logistic hubs. When it comes to the electricity, Cuba has frequent blackouts and fuel shortages. Panama has mostly stable grid. There's investment in renewables and hydroelectricity. When it comes to healthcare, Cuba's is universal and free, but it's very under-resourced. Panama's is universal in theory, better private care, regional gaps in quality. When it comes to the education, Cuba's is state-run, free, high literacy, politically controlled, where Panama's is publicly educated and it's improving but uneven. The private sector also plays a growing role in it. The internet is state controlled, expensive, and censored in Cuba, while it is widely available, uncensored, and a modern digital economy growing rapidly in Panama. So, when it comes to the infrastructure, the similarities is that both offer free basic services nominally, though the difference is that Panama has a modern infrastructure, global connectivity, and tech access, where Cuba is isolated, deteriorated, and censored. The final category is the geography. So when it comes to the location, Cuba is a large island in the Caribbean Sea. Panama is a narrow isthmus linking Central and South America together, borders on both oceans. The terrain in Cuba involves lowlands, hills, and eastern mountains, while it involves mountains, rainforests, coastlines, and the Panama Canal, which is man-made in Panama. The climates in both are tropical, though it's more hurricane-prone in Cuba. There's fewer hurricanes in Panama due to the latitude, but there is high rainfall. In Cuba, the natural resources involve nickel, tobacco, sugar, and limited oil, while in Panama, it involves tropical hardwoods, shrimp, copper, and strategic canal location. In Cuba, the strategic importance is the military and ideological thoughts during the Cold War, while in Panama, the strategic importance is the global trade crossroads, shipping, and logistics hub due to the canal. So, when it comes to the overall similarity of both in the geography category, they're both tropical climates and they involve coastal economies, or they have coastal economies. The difference is that Panama has geostrategic importance due to the canal, while Cuba is geographically isolated and politically cut off from the global trade. So the overall similarities involving the five categories is that they're both Spanish-speaking, racially mixed Caribbean-influenced societies with strong baseball culture, Catholic heritage with regional music and dance traditions, tropical climate and hurricane vulnerability, and U.S. historical environment, the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Panama Canal Zone. When it comes to the differences, is the political systems, where Cuba is a communist dictatorship, Panama is a capitalist democracy. Their global role is different, where Cuba is isolated and anti-Western, where Panama is a global trade and finance hub. The infrastructure is crumbling and outdated in Cuba, where it is modern and globally integrated in Panama. The culture is Afro-Caribbean cultural export in Cuba, while it's a cosmopolitan blend due to immigration in Panama. The economy is central planning and rationing in Cuba, while it is a free market, service-based export economy in Panama. So the fifth and final country in this ranking that isn't in the honorable mention but the top five is Costa Rica with a score of 71.3. So when it comes to the demographics, Costa Rica has a population of 5.2 million, while Cuba has a population of 11 million, so over twice the amount. The ethnic composition in Cuba is 64% mixed race. We know this is most likely mulatto, 27% white, and 9% black, where in Costa Rica it's 83% white slash mestizo. So it's interesting that they grouped those two racial groups together. 7% indigenous and 2% black, with small Chinese and Afro Caribbean minorities. I don't remember if Costa Rica is one of the whiter nations in Central America. That might be something I have to research. So they both speak Spanish, though Costa Rica has a Central American dialect and Cuba has a Caribbean dialect, and there is some English in Costa Rica on the Caribbean coast. Both are heavily Catholic, though evangelicalism is growing rapidly in Costa Rica, and Santeria is still practiced in Cuba as well. So Costa Rica has a smaller diaspora, where Costa Rica is more of a destination area for migrants, or they leave for destination, i.e. Nicaraguans and Venezuelans, than it being a source. And obviously, a majority of Cubans move to Miami. So the similarities when it comes to demographics, they're both Spanish-speaking, Catholic majority, and racially mixed. The difference is Costa Rica is more European descended with less Afro-Caribbean and Santeria influence. Cuba has a much larger immigrant population. So when it comes to the culture, Costa Rica has a lot of folk music, shockingly, with marimba, cumbia, and more localized cultural practice, where Cuba is more culturally influential through salsa, son, rumba, and timba. The dance in Cuba is more Afro-Caribbean themed, like salsa and rumba, while in Costa Rica it's more folk dance, salsa as well, cumbia, and traditional punto guanacasteco. My Spanish isn't good at all, so apologies if I end up screwing it up, which I probably did. When it comes to the cuisine, it is very simple in Cuba, with rice, beans, pork, food shortages being common. Sorry, food shortages being common there. Where in Costa Rica, the cuisine is gallo pinto, tamales, casado, broader access to ingredients and fresh fruit. So baseball is very dominant in Cuba, and this is the first country on the list where the competing country doesn't have baseball there, where it's soccer in Costa Rica, i.e. football, is by far the most popular sport there. So the art scene in Costa Rica is modest, it's less internationally prominent, but more free and diverse creatively compared to Cuba, where it's more state-sponsored, where it's ideological, though it does have a high global visibility. So when it comes to the culture, they share Spanish colonial roots and folk music traditions, where the difference is that Cuba has global cultural exports through music and dance, where Costa Rica is sports focused, i.e., soccer, and culturally more conservative. When it comes to the government, Cuba is a one party communist state, where Costa Rica has had a stable presidential democracy since 1949. The Communist Party rule has Diaz-Canel in the head of state. In Cuba, where in Costa Rica, they have elected presidents, where it's currently Rodrigo Chavez from 2022 to president, though that will end in 2026. The civil liberties in Cuba involve restricted press, speech, and political opposition, where in Costa Rica, it is strong protections for free press, protest right, and judiciary independence. The military in Cuba is centralized and powerful. There's no standing army in Costa Rica since 1948, which is very rare globally. The foreign policy in Cuba is anti-US. It's aligned with Russia, China, and Venezuela, where Costa Rica is a US ally. They are pro-democracy, diplomacy, neutral but globally engaged. The similarities when it comes to the government is that they are relatively independent from colonial control since the early Cold War. The difference is that Cuba is a militarized dictatorship, Costa Rica is demilitarized and democratic. The fourth category is infrastructure, where when it comes to the transportation, Cuba has a lot of old vehicles, limited fuel, weak public transit, where Costa Rica has road networks that are underdeveloped in parts, but functional enough. The major tourism-based infrastructure investments definitely helps with the transportation there. When it comes to the electricity, Cuba has frequent blackouts and fuel shortages, where Costa Rica has broad access to electricity, primarily from renewable energy, which is 98%. Very impressive, might I add. Or may I add there. The healthcare in Cuba is free and universal. It is well trained staff, or it has well trained staff, but supply shortages where there is universal healthcare in Costa Rica called CAJA, better funded than most of Latin America, especially in urban areas. The education in Cuba is free and universal, though it is ideologically shaped, where in Costa Rica it is free and high quality public education, high literacy, emphasis on environment and innovation. The internet in Cuba is state controlled, censored with limited access, where in Costa Rica it is widely available, fast growing digital economy, and there's no censorship policies. The similarity when it comes to the infrastructure is that there's a commitment to universal education and healthcare. The difference is that Costa Rica has a far superior infrastructure and digital freedom. Cuba faces chronic shortages and censorship. The fifth and final category is geography, where Cuba is a Caribbean island, Costa Rica is in Central America, bordered by Nicaragua and Panama, with both Pacific and Caribbean coasts on each side of it. The terrain in Cuba involves plains, low hills, and mountains in the east, where it has mountains, volcanoes, rainforests, dual coasts, and rich biodiversity in Costa Rica. The climate in both is tropical, though Cuba is more hurricane prone. The Pacific side of Costa Rica has dry and wet seasons. The Caribbean side is rainy year-round. The natural resources in Cuba involves nickel, sugar, tobacco, small oil reserves, where in Costa Rica it involves hydroelectric, forests, fertile soil, ecotourism, biodiversity, hotspots. The environmental significance in Cuba involves biodiverse but deranged by agriculture and tourism limitations, where the environmental significance in Costa Rica involves global leadership in conservation. National parks cover is 25% of the land. Carbon neutral goals by 2050. The similarity in geography is the tropical, hurricane prone biodiversity, where the difference is Costa Rica is globally renowned for environmental policy and ecotourism. Cuba is more agriculturally focused with limited conservation policies. So the overall similarities between the two countries is that they're both Spanish-speaking, racially mixed populations, the colonial heritage and Catholic traditions, the universal education and healthcare systems, the tropical climate with hurricane exposure, and the tourism importance, though Cuba's is state-run and limited. When it comes to the differences, or the top differences, Cuba has a communist dictatorship, where Costa Rica has a stable democracy with no military. The civil liberties are different, where Cuba has censorship, repression, and a one party state, where Costa Rica has freedom of expression, voting, and press. The infrastructure is also underdeveloped in Cuba, with shortages, and it's state run, where in Costa Rica it is modernizing eco-conscious, and it has a digital economy. The cultural reach in Cuba is global via its music and dance, where in Costa Rica it's more localized, but it's growing in cultural significance. The environmental policy in Cuba is limited, centralized, and underfunded, where in Costa Rica it is a global conservation leader, ecotourism pioneer. Now it's time to get into the honorable mentions, and if I extended this to a top 10 list, this would be 6 to 5, essentially. So we have El Salvador, Mexico, Colombia, Puerto Rico, and Honduras, and in that order. I'm only going to do a very, very brief summary of Cuba's similarities and differences with each of the five countries, since it's an honorable mentions list, or this part is an honorable mention, so they're not in the top five, meaning I'm not going to go into detail about them since they didn't make the top five. So, with El Salvador, the similarity between Cuba and El Salvador is that they're both authoritarian tendencies, or sorry, they're both authoritarian countries with obviously authoritarian tendencies. They both speak Spanish and they have Catholic backgrounds, where the difference is El Salvador is landlocked from the Caribbean and it's much more gang plagued and very evangelical today. So the similarities between Cuba and Mexico is that they both have colonial history. They believe in Catholicism in a mass majority, and they have strong cultural exports, where the difference is Mexico's obviously much more populous than Cuba, the capitalist and regionally dominant, where Cuba is ideologically isolated. With Colombia and Cuba, the similarities they share is that they both have strong Afro-Latino or Afro-Latin cultural pockets, and they are both tropical with coastal regions. The difference is that Cuba is centralized and repressive, where Colombia is more capitalist and export-driven despite internal conflict. Puerto Rico's technically not a country, it's a territory, but it's on the list that objectives lists use, so I'm going to just keep it here. So the similarities between Cuba and Puerto Rico is that culturally they are extremely similar, where they both speak Caribbean Spanish, their music is very similar, they have the same diaspora ties, baseball's huge in both countries, and they have the same racial mix. But the key difference is that Puerto Rico is obviously a U.S. territory with open access to migration, dollars, and democracy, unlike Cuba for obvious reasons. And the final country is Honduras, where the similarities between the two countries is poverty or sharing poverty, migration, corruption, U.S. historical interference, where the difference is Honduras is plagued by violence and gang warfare, while Cuba is politically stable but repressive and economically decaying. Anyways, thank you for watching this video, and I can't wait to do more videos like this on other Caribbean countries to see which ones are similar, which ones are different, and to know more about the country and how they function. I am going to do other types of videos that are definitely more specific to certain demographic groups, and I can't wait to unleash that soon. Anyways, thank you for watching, and I'll be back with more soon.